They destroyed the stone bridge where I proposed to my wife. I said, fine, see you in court and at the dam. 3 months later, I turned that valve and watched their $1.8 million resort turn into a mud pit. Want to hear the judge say, injunction denied? Comment what state you're watching from and subscribe to Karen Stories. 9. Here we go. The smell of expensive coffee couldn't mask the tension in Vivien Blackwood's glass-walled living room that overlooked Crystal Lake. 15 homeowners sat in her designer chairs, most clutching printed agendas like shields, while she clicked through her PowerPoint presentation titled Bridge Safety Assessment. I stood by the window watching morning mist rise off the water where my grandfather's stone bridge had stood for 70 years, the same bridge where I proposed to Sarah before cancer took her 3 years ago. Now this HOA queen wanted it gone, and she'd dressed up her power grab in safety concerns and community standards. The irony wasn't lost on me that a woman who'd never served a day in her life was lecturing a former Army Corps of Engineers officer about structural integrity. Vivien's manicured finger pointed at grainy black and white photos of my bridge on her massive television screen. The woman had clearly spent more on her sound system than most people make in a year, but she was using it to broadcast what looked like evidence from a 1,972nd UFO sighting. She read from what she called a comprehensive structural assessment report, complete with engineering jargon about load-bearing concerns and public safety risks that would make any homeowner nervous. The photos were so blurry they could have been anything, and the technical language was impressive enough to fool people who didn't know better. I let her finish her performance before I spoke up, keeping my voice calm and level like I'd learned during 20 years of military briefings. Interesting report, Vivien. Mind if I see the licensed engineer's signature and the survey coordinates where these measurements were taken? The room went quiet except for the hum of her espresso machine and the nervous shuffling of papers. That's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold and my military training kick into high alert. The header on her report read Blackwood Construction Consulting, and in small print below, Principal Engineer Marcus Blackwood. The whole room erupted in whispers when I pointed this out, with several neighbors looking genuinely shocked at the obvious conflict of interest. Her own brother-in-law had written a structural assessment without ever setting foot on my property, using photos that looked like they were taken with a disposable camera from 1995. The report was worth less than the paper it was printed on, but Vivien pushed forward anyway, like a general whose battle plan had just fallen apart. She called for a vote to demolish the bridge within 30 days with daily fines of $500 if I didn't comply with community aesthetic standards. The vote passed 11-4, with most people looking uncomfortable but unwilling to challenge the HOA president's authority. Instead of arguing with 15 people who'd already made up their minds based on fraudulent evidence, I packed up my folder and headed straight to the county records office the next morning. This wasn't my first time dealing with bureaucratic warfare, and I knew that paper trails beat emotional arguments every single time. Dust motes danced in shafts of sunlight as I dug through yellowed maps and documents that smelled like old leather and decades of bureaucracy. The clerk, a patient woman named Dorothy who'd been there since the Carter administration, helped me navigate filing cabinets that contained the entire legal history of our lakefront community. Hours of searching through property deeds, easement records, and survey maps finally paid off when I found what I was looking for buried in a folder marked Historical Easements 1940 to 1950, a 1,943 county easement document with an official raised seal showed that my stone bridge sat entirely within a public right-of-way, making it county property that the HOA had exactly zero authority to touch. At the next board meeting, I spread that easement map across Vivien's Italian marble coffee table, while Deputy Maria Santos, who I'd called as a witness, nodded approvingly at the document's authenticity. The deputy had served 2 tours in Iraq and understood the importance of proper documentation in legal matters. Vivien's confident smile faded as she realized her power play had backfired spectacularly, transforming her from an authority figure into someone who just tried to illegally demolish county property. The legal implications were serious enough that several board members started distancing themselves from the vote they'd just taken. But instead of backing down gracefully, Vivien just shifted tactics with the persistence of someone who'd never been told no. If she couldn't destroy my bridge legally, she'd make my life miserable in other ways that wouldn't show up in county records. That's when the petty harassment campaign began, and I knew this war was just getting started. As the meeting broke up in uncomfortable silence, I noticed something unexpected that reminded me why I'd fallen in love with this community in the first place. When Vivien stumbled slightly in her designer heels while hurrying to escort people out, it was Amira Salem, who steadied her, the same woman who'd been fighting HOA violations for months over her Middle Eastern garden decorations. Even after all the harassment about cultural symbols and property values, Amira's instinct was to help someone in need. The moment was captured by Paige Liu's phone camera, and the image would later go viral with comments about grace under pressure and community values. It was a small reminder that beneath all the bureaucratic warfare, real human decency still existed in our neighborhood. But as I walked back to my truck, I could see Vivien through her window already on the phone with someone probably planning her next move in what was becoming an all-out war for control of our community's soul. The harassment started small but escalated quickly like a wildfire fed by bureaucratic oxygen and personal vindictiveness. Violations appeared in my mailbox almost daily, each one more ridiculous than the last, and clearly designed to drain my bank account through death by 1,000 cuts. My boat tarp was apparently the wrong shade of blue according to a color chart that looked like it came from a 1,982nd paint store. My grass measured 3.22 inches instead of the required 3 inches maximum, and my dock lights weren't the approved lumens, according to a specification that had apparently been written by someone with a photometer and too much time. Each violation came with mounting fines that threatened to put a lien on my property, turning my home into collateral for Vivien's revenge campaign. Meanwhile, a gray sedan with tinted windows parked across from my house every morning, and I could see the telephoto lens pointing at my windows like something out of a Cold War spy novel. The Nextdoor app exploded with rumors about my PTSD and how I was supposedly dangerous to the community posts that read like they'd been written by someone who'd watched too many movies about unhinged veterans. Anonymous accounts with usernames like ConcernedNeighbor47 and SafetyFirst posted long screeds about how my military background made me unpredictable and potentially violent. The posts gained traction among newer residents who didn't know me personally, creating an echo chamber of fear that fed on itself with each share and comment. Time to fight back with what I knew best from my engineering background and military training: data documentation and the systematic destruction of lies through irrefutable evidence. If Vivien wanted to play information warfare, she'd picked the wrong opponent. I'd been documenting infrastructure projects and legal compliance since before she learned how to spell litigation. I started recording everything with my old Army-issued body camera, creating an unshakable digital paper trail of every interaction with HOA representatives, delivery personnel, and the private investigator who was clearly being paid to manufacture evidence. When their PI called the sheriff's department claiming I was threatening neighbors with aggressive behavior, I had time-stamped footage, proving I'd been inside my house watching the History Channel documentary about D-Day landings. When they reported loud music and disruptive parties at 2 a.m. on weeknights, my security system showed I'd been asleep since 10 p.m. with my sleep apnea machine running. Each false report got documented, filed with proper timestamps, and prepared for the counterattack I was planning with the methodical precision of a military operation. The beauty of fighting bureaucrats is that they always underestimate the power of their own bureaucracy when it's turned against them by someone who actually understands how systems work. Local reporter Paige Liu started covering the story after my documentation went viral on social media, turning a neighborhood dispute into a case study of HOA overreach and veteran discrimination. Her initial article, titled "Bridge Over Troubled Water, HOA versus Plaint," Army veteran brought the community battle into the spotlight, and suddenly everyone had an opinion about property rights versus community standards. The comment sections became battlegrounds between people who supported individual liberty and those who believed in strict community enforcement, reflecting broader American tensions about government authority and personal freedom. This wasn't just about a bridge anymore. It was touching on deeper issues that Americans were grappling with everywhere from school board meetings to congressional hearings. Rising HOA fees were crushing retirees on fixed incomes, while property management companies got richer, and my fight was becoming a symbol of resistance against unchecked bureaucratic power. Things escalated dramatically when my dock support posts were cut during the night, nearly sending my boat crashing into the lake bottom and causing thousands in potential damage. But I'd learned from decades of military engineering to prepare for sabotage and asymmetric warfare tactics. My infrared trail cameras, positioned at strategic points around my property, captured a figure in white clothing with a distinctive gait that Walt Henderson, my former military police neighbor, immediately identified as consistent with Vivien's height and movement patterns. The footage wasn't clear enough for criminal charges that would stick in court, but it was plenty clear enough to establish a pattern of escalation and harassment that any reasonable person could recognize. Someone was getting desperate, and desperate people make mistakes that create opportunities for those patient enough to wait for the right moment to strike back. I'd been quietly researching the legal framework around Crystal Lake itself during late-night sessions that reminded me of intelligence gathering during my deployment years, and what I discovered changed everything about this conflict. The lake was artificial, created in 1969 by damming Eagle Creek with federal environmental oversight, and I owned the original 1,981 deed to the dam structure itself through a property transfer that had been overlooked during subsequent development. More importantly, environmental regulations required periodic draining for inspection and maintenance, something that hadn't been done in 17 years due to bureaucratic negligence and developer pressure. I had both the legal right and the environmental obligation to drain the lake for safety inspections regardless of what any HOA thought about recreational impacts. The same woman trying to destroy my bridge had built her entire resort business on water she didn't control, and Memorial Day weekend was coming up the same weekend. Vivien planned her resort's grand opening with paying guests, expecting luxury lakefront accommodations. The timing was going to be absolutely perfect for delivering justice with the precision of a military operation and the legal backing of federal environmental law. Vivien had picked a fight with someone who understood both engineering and legal compliance, and she was about to learn that some battles can't be won through intimidation and harassment. As I sat on my grandfather's bridge that evening watching the sunset reflect off water that would soon reveal its secrets, I felt Sarah's presence in the gentle breeze and knew she'd approve of standing up to bullies who thought power came from fear rather than respect. The countdown to Vivien's public humiliation had officially begun, and unlike her fraudulent structural report, my plan was built on solid legal foundation that would withstand any challenge she could mount. Rebecca Sterling, my water rights attorney and a former environmental prosecutor, spread the legal precedents across her conference table like a general planning a battle campaign with decades of case law as ammunition. The documents told a clear story that would make any reasonable judge take notice and think twice before ruling against federal environmental regulations. California drought cases from 2015 established that environmental safety and water management superseded private recreational interests, especially when public infrastructure was involved. Federal dam safety regulations required comprehensive inspection every 15 years, and Crystal Lake was 2 years overdue for maintenance that could prevent catastrophic failure downstream. My ownership of the dam structure, combined with my professional background as an Army Corps of Engineers veteran with active security clearance, gave me both the legal authority and moral responsibility to conduct necessary maintenance, regardless of local opposition. The legal foundation was rock solid, built on federal environmental law that trumped local HOA authority, but Vivien wasn't going down without a fight that would expose her true character to the entire community. Her attorney Cliff Bender, a slick operator who charged fees based on percentage of total fines collected, filed for an emergency injunction to prevent any water level changes, claiming massive economic and environmental damage that would devastate the local economy. The morning hearing packed the courtroom with residents from both sides of the conflict, creating an atmosphere that felt more like a town hall meeting than a legal proceeding. Bender argued that draining the lake would destroy property values, kill fish populations, and devastate the local economy, just as summer tourism season began painting me as a vindictive neighbor using environmental regulations to settle personal scores. He brought charts showing potential revenue losses and expert testimony from a marine biologist who'd clearly been paid to emphasize worst-case scenarios. Rebecca countered with scientific studies, showing that periodic draining actually improved water quality by reducing algae blooms, removing accumulated sediment, and restoring natural spawning cycles for native fish species that had been struggling in the stagnant artificial environment. The judge, a no-nonsense woman named Patricia Chen, who'd been handling environmental cases for 20 years, listened to both arguments with the patience of someone who'd heard every possible variation of development versus conservation disputes. When she delivered her ruling, it carried the weight of legal precedent and environmental science behind every word. Environmental stewardship and public safety concerns outweighed private recreational interests, especially when federal regulations mandated the inspection and state environmental agencies supported the maintenance plan. She noted that the lake's artificial nature meant it wasn't protected under natural waterway preservation laws, and that my professional qualifications and federal clearance made me uniquely qualified to oversee the process. Safety. My maintenance plan included detailed provisions for fish relocation, controlled water release to minimize downstream impact and coordination with state environmental monitors. The gavel came down with a decisive thud that echoed through the packed courtroom. Injunction denied. Proceed according to the submitted timeline and environmental protocols. Vivien's face went pale as she realized her legal challenge had failed completely, and her grand opening was about to become a public relations disaster. But the real drama was just beginning, and it would expose the criminal lengths Vivien was willing to go to protect her investment. That night, security cameras positioned around the dam infrastructure caught Rex Hardwick, Vivien's preferred contractor, and a man with a reputation for cutting corners, attempting to damage the spillway mechanism with bolt cutters and a crowbar. Walt Henderson's military training kicked in as he called out the sabotage attempt from his concealed observation post, and we caught Rex red-handed with detailed technical instructions that could only have come from someone with inside knowledge of the dam's operation and access to engineering specifications. The incident report filed with the county sheriff's department now included felony charges for infrastructure, sabotage, and domestic terrorism, transforming this from a civil dispute into a criminal matter with serious federal consequences. Rex was looking at potential prison time for damaging critical infrastructure, and the paper trail would lead directly back to whoever had paid him and provided the technical information. The timing couldn't have been more perfect from a justice perspective, like watching karma operate with military precision and legal backing. Memorial Day weekend was traditionally the lake's busiest period, when boat rentals and waterfront businesses made their biggest profits of the year, and families created memories that lasted lifetimes. Vivien's resort was scheduled for its soft opening the same weekend. I planned to begin the drainage process with paying guests, expecting luxury lakefront accommodations, private boat slips, and water sports activities. Her marketing materials had promised an exclusive retreat where guests could enjoy pristine lake views and recreational activities in a peaceful setting. Soon she'd be promising them a front-row seat to watch million-dollar boats sitting in mud while environmental inspectors took soil samples and documented decades of ecological damage. The countdown to her public humiliation had officially begun, and unlike her fraudulent structural report, this justice would be delivered with legal precision and environmental science backing every decision. As I reviewed the final drainage timeline with Marcus Anderson, my former colleague, now working as county environmental inspector, I felt the satisfaction of a plan coming together with military efficiency. The process would take approximately 6 hours to lower water levels by 6 feet, exposing the lake bottom and revealing the environmental damage that recreational development had caused over decades. Fish relocation teams were standing by to preserve native species. Environmental monitors would document the restoration process, and media outlets had been notified of the educational opportunity to witness proper environmental stewardship in action. Vivien had built her empire on borrowed water and fraudulent reports, but science and law were about to expose the foundation of lies beneath her luxury facade. Memorial Day weekend would indeed be memorable, just not in the way she'd planned when she decided to declare war on a veteran who understood both engineering and justice. The county's official notice posting created a media sensation that spread far beyond our small lakefront community, turning a local dispute into a national conversation about environmental responsibility and HOA overreach. Environmental Services issued a comprehensive public statement explaining the drainage as routine maintenance required under federal dam safety regulations, complete with scientific justification about restoring natural water levels for spring spawning seasons and removing accumulated sediment that was choking aquatic ecosystems. Eleanor Murphy, my retired teacher ally who understood narrative power better than most political consultants, masterfully framed the story as environmental stewardship rather than personal revenge through carefully crafted press releases that emphasized scientific methodology and regulatory compliance. Her background in education served her well, as she explained complex environmental concepts in terms that average citizens could understand and support. The narrative war was being won by facts, environmental science, and a clear explanation of federal regulations that put public safety above private profit. Vivien launched her own media counteroffensive, hiring an expensive PR firm from the state capitol to spin the drainage as economic sabotage targeting working families who depended on summer tourism revenue for their livelihoods. She organized protests with professionally printed signs reading "Save Our Lake" and "Stop Economic Terrorism," coordinating social media campaigns using hashtags like #economic sabotage, #stop the drain, and #save local jobs that gained traction among people who didn't understand the environmental science involved. Her media appearances featured carefully coached talking points about job losses, property value destruction, and the rights of business owners to operate without government interference, playing into broader American anxieties about regulatory overreach and economic uncertainty. But Page Liu's fact-checking articles consistently supported the environmental and legal justifications for the drainage, citing peer-reviewed studies and federal regulations that made Vivien's claims look increasingly desperate and scientifically illiterate. When Vivien claimed the process would kill thousands of fish, environmental scientists explained how controlled drainage actually improved fish habitat by reducing stagnant water conditions, algae blooms, and artificial population pressures. The insurance angle provided another devastating blow to Vivien's resort plans, exposing the financial house of cards that supported her luxury development dreams. Her business policy specifically excluded coverage for damages related to natural water level changes, including drainage for maintenance purposes, a standard clause that had been included in lakefront business policies since the California droughts made water management issues more common. The insurance company's position was crystal clear and legally bulletproof. If the water level dropped due to legal environmental compliance activities, they wouldn't pay a penny for lost bookings, stranded boats, or business interruption claims. This exclusion clause had been standard in lakefront business policies for over a decade, but Vivien apparently hadn't read the fine print when she signed up for coverage, trusting her expensive lawyers to handle details while she focused on marketing and profit projections. Her million-dollar investment was about to become a million-dollar loss with no safety net, and the financial consequences would ripple through her entire business empire. The community split became even more apparent as Memorial Day weekend approached, reflecting broader American cultural and generational divides that went far beyond local politics. Newer residents who'd bought expensive lakefront homes rallied behind Vivien, seeing the drainage as an attack on their property values and recreational lifestyle that they'd paid premium prices to enjoy. These were often retirees from urban areas who'd moved to the lake for peace and luxury, not environmental education and regulatory compliance. Longtime residents who remembered the lake before extensive development supported the environmental restoration, especially veterans like Mr. Ortiz, who'd lost his son in Afghanistan and saw this as part of preserving what the community used to represent before it became a playground for wealthy outsiders. The generational and cultural divide reflected broader American tensions about development versus conservation, individual rights versus community authority, and whether environmental protection was more important than economic development. In an era of climate change and resource scarcity, social media amplified these divisions with the intensity of a presidential election, turning neighbors into enemies and creating echo chambers that reinforced existing beliefs rather than promoting understanding. The debate touched on immigration policy when Amira Salem's support for environmental restoration was attacked by anonymous accounts, questioning whether foreigners should have a voice in American community decisions. Middle East tensions surfaced when Rabbi Levin's support for following federal environmental law was met with barely disguised anti-Semitic comments about outside agitators and cultural influence that forced moderators to lock comment threads and report threats to law enforcement. These broader cultural tensions were playing out in microcosm around Crystal Lake, turning what should have been a straightforward environmental compliance issue into a referendum on American identity, community values, and who had the right to determine the future of shared spaces. The night before the drainage began, I stood on my grandfather's stone bridge, holding Sarah's old engagement ring box, letting the weight of memory settle over me, like morning mist rising from water that reflected stars unchanged. Since 1943, the lake held 70 years of history in its artificial depths, from my grandfather's construction work during World War II through my proposal to Sarah on this same bridge, and now to this moment of reckoning that would restore natural cycles and expose the truth beneath Vivien's facade of luxury and control. Tomorrow would bring justice delivered through proper legal channels and environmental science, but tonight belonged to remembrance and reflection on what we were truly fighting to preserve. The bridge would stand as a monument to persistence and principle, representing the values that built America and the determination required to defend them against those who mistook wealth for wisdom and authority for righteousness. Some things were worth fighting for, regardless of personal cost, and tomorrow the entire community would see what happened when greed and lies met science and law in open combat. Memorial Day morning arrived with 3 local news crews, 2 environmental documentary filmmakers, and an official county drone documenting the drainage process for environmental compliance records that would be studied by researchers for decades. Deputy Santos maintained professional order as residents gathered in clusters that clearly reflected the community's divisions, with Vivien's supporters holding protest signs while environmental advocates carried banners celebrating restoration and federal law compliance. The brass valve wheel felt cold and solid in my hands, a piece of engineering that had controlled this artificial lake for over 40 years, as I began the slow, counterclockwise rotation that would drop water levels by 2 feet per hour, according to the carefully calculated timeline approved by environmental scientists. The mechanical grinding of old metal echoed across the lake like a judgment bell, announcing the end of Vivien's reign of harassment and the beginning of environmental justice that had been delayed for nearly 2 decades. Paige Liu provided live commentary with the precision of a sports announcer, her graphics showing how 6 hours of drainage would expose approximately 6 feet of lakebed and reveal the environmental damage that decades of recreational development had hidden beneath the surface. The environmental monitoring team documented everything in real time for their restoration report, noting areas where algae blooms had created dead zones, where sediment buildup was choking native plant growth, and where artificial water levels had disrupted natural spawning cycles that indigenous fish species had followed for thousands of years before development arrived. What looked like destruction to Vivien's supporters was actually revealing decades of ecological damage that periodic drainage could have prevented if profit hadn't been prioritized over environmental stewardship. The science was playing out in real time, with crystal clarity vindicating every argument Rebecca had made in court about environmental stewardship versus recreational exploitation, and the legal authority of federal regulations over local business interests. That's when Vivien completely lost control of both her emotions and her carefully constructed public image. She shoved me hard enough to make Deputy Santos step in with professional restraint, and the cameras caught every moment of her meltdown as she screamed about economic terrorism, personal vendettas, and government overreach, while her resort guests stood in awkward silence, wondering if they should demand refunds. Mascara streaked down her cheeks as she realized that all her money, lawyers, and political connections couldn't stop federal environmental law from taking its course. But the real knockout punch came when her phone started ringing with calls from investors, creditors, and business partners who were watching the live coverage and reading the loan covenants that specifically required maintaining lakefront access and recreational water depth of minimum 8 feet for commercial watercraft operations. Her entire financial structure was collapsing in real time on live television, and the legal language she'd ignored was now destroying her business empire one phone call at a time. Rex Hardwick chose that moment of maximum chaos to deliver the final evidence that would seal Vivien's fate and destroy any remaining credibility she might have maintained. He approached through the crowd with a USB drive and a guilty expression, apparently having realized that felony infrastructure sabotage charges carried serious prison time that his family couldn't afford. The USB contained detailed text messages where Vivien had paid him $5,000 to disable the spillway mechanism, along with precise engineering diagrams of the dam's control systems that could only have come from someone with access to county infrastructure records. His conscience had apparently kicked in when he realized the federal charges he was facing, and now he was providing evidence of criminal conspiracy to damage public infrastructure that would follow Vivien through both criminal and civil courts for years. The USB also contained financial records, showing how Vivien had been systematically using HOA beautification funds to pay for her resort's marketing campaign, turning community dues into personal business expenses in violation of both state law and federal tax regulations. The aftermath unfolded with the systematic precision of a military operation combined with the slow grind of democratic accountability. Community members organized a recall petition that gathered 67% of required signatures within 2 weeks, officially removing Vivien and her allies from the HOA board through a process that restored faith in local democracy and citizen participation. Cliff Bender's law firm quietly ended their contract when the criminal conspiracy evidence surfaced, leaving Vivien without legal representation, just as federal environmental investigators began their comprehensive audit of HOA finances and business practices. The Beautification Fund audit revealed tens of thousands in misallocated expenses, triggering both civil and criminal investigations that would follow Vivien through bankruptcy proceedings and potential criminal trials. Justice wasn't just served, it was documented, legally sealed, and broadcast to the world as an example of what happened when greed met accountability in American democracy. The lake's restoration exceeded everyone's expectations except those of us who understood environmental science and natural ecosystem recovery. Fish populations increased by 40% within 3 months, as cleaner water and restored spawning areas revitalized the ecosystem that had been struggling under artificial conditions for decades. Water clarity improved dramatically without the algae blooms that had plagued summer recreation, creating the pristine conditions that early settlers had described in letters home. Mr. Ortiz and I raised a new memorial flag honoring his fallen son, creating a permanent tribute that the old HOA had blocked for aesthetic reasons but now flew proudly as a symbol of service and sacrifice. Amira Salem won the catering contract for the new annual Stewardship Day celebration, bringing her family's Middle Eastern fusion cuisine to community events where everyone was welcome regardless of immigration status, religious background, or how long their families had lived in America. My stone bridge was officially designated a community heritage structure by unanimous vote of the new HOA board, with a bronze plaque honoring Sarah's memory and the 7 decades of history it represented in the face of bureaucratic intimidation and corporate greed. The new board, elected by overwhelming community support in an election that saw record turnout, established the Lake Conservation Committee with me as chairman, ensuring that environmental stewardship would guide all future development decisions through scientific expertise rather than political pressure. Children now learn to fish from the restored shoreline, while Walt tells stories about military service, community responsibility, and the importance of standing up to bullies regardless of their wealth or connections. The sound of laughter echoes across water that runs clear and true, carrying the voices of families who understand that some battles are worth fighting not for personal gain but for the principles that make communities worth preserving for future generations. This story represents the power ordinary citizens hold when they understand their rights and refuse to be intimidated by wealth and false authority. Whether facing an overreaching HOA, corrupt officials, or any institution prioritizing profit over people, the tools of democracy remain available to those brave enough to use them. Have you stood up to bureaucratic bullies or neighbors who thought rules only applied to others? Share your story below. If this tale of justice and community restoration resonated with you, subscribe to Karen Stories 9 for more accounts of citizens defending their principles against institutional overreach. Every subscription supports documenting these vital stories of civic courage.